some very specific defects. Understanding language in Wernicke's area, and then speaking language like generating speech in Broca's area. So this brings us into going from the sensory area to this motor area, because this generating speech is going to be in the front of the brain, and it's going to be about motor activity, like actually making activity, right? So this Broca's area is in the front of your brain, and this whole front of your brain, which is going to be part of your motor area of your brain. Right. So if the back of your brain is mostly sensory, front of your brain is going to be all about anterior of your brain. And I'm going to include in the motor area as really long range kind of planning stuff in your prefrontal cortex, that place that you get a lobotomy in, right? So the prefrontal cortex here is your so-called executive function part of your brain, right? And it's going to be task management, planning ahead, kind of organizing material in your head so you can actually carry out a plan, right? And kind of considering different things like, is this going to hurt me? Or why should I do this? All that stuff is going to be happening in this region before you make a plan, unless you're a very impulsive type, right? This is your higher level. This is the highest level stuff you go on right here, right? And the reason you would do a lobotomy here is more of it's part of your connection to your emotional part of your brain, right? Because they're going to be talking to each other. But this prefrontal cortex, right? I'm calling this motor because it's all going to be about action, right? Thinking ahead, planning for the future, anticipating stuff like, time traveling in your head, thinking of the past, thinking of the future. All that stuff is going to be happening here to kind of incorporate into what you should do at any given moment. Right? That's your prefrontal cortex in the front. But when all is said and done, you got all this planning done in complex ways we're not going to talk about. Those plans start to be formulated in what's called the premotor cortex. And that's basically all you got to know. But like I said, all this planning is going on. It's going this way now. Right? Remember, the brain is kind of going out to these association areas for, from the information coming in, and then it was being kind of higher order sent inward. In the case of the brain, we're going to be formulating stuff, sent to premotor areas, and then eventually it's going to be sent to this primary motor cortex right here for final output. So this is the primary motor cortex in the front of the brain. In fact, it's right on the other side of the central sulcus, right? Here was the posterior post-central gyrus, the primary somatosensory cortex. And then right on the other side, we're going to have the pre-central gyrus, which is going to have the primary motor cortex. And we'll have a map, just like your sensory one, except it's going to be the motor homunculus. And instead of receiving information from your skin, these neurons are the ones that control the muscles of your thumb or the muscles of your tongue or lips or facial expression. And these are the neurons that will ultimately control those, send the commands out to the spinal cord neurons to the motor units, and cause that action potential and cause the neuromuscular junction in your zygomatic major to contract, right? So that's what's going on in your primary motor cortex here. There's a map of it. It's distorted because the same region, the sensory one, we have a lot more fine control over our hand than we do our trunk muscles, right? We don't need so many motor neurons. This has to do with the motor units, remember, fine control, a lot more motor units per muscle fibers. So you have a lot more motor neurons controlling your hand, your lips, your facial muscles, and your tongue than over here, hence the greater number of motor neurons in that space. Does anybody say, I have no idea what they're talking about here? Or I explained it so well that you totally understand this high level stuff, because it is high level. But in any case, now we're going backwards. Remember, with the sensory, we started down here, and then we went up to the brain, and then we kind of went to higher order association areas for the motor. We're going starting with those higher order association areas, going to the primary motor cortex, and then descending, right? Descending down through these descending tracks and then going to talk to those motor nuclei, ventral horn motor nuclei, out to the skeletal muscles of your limbs or your face or your neck or whatever, right? These would be that motor pathways. All right, everybody kind of get the brain picture, right? Front of the brain, motor, back of the brain, different types of sensory information. And for the most part, you know, you got a left and right brain. And they're mostly, if you looked at them, anatomical, gross anatomical, they'd look almost exactly the same. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference. However, they know from these functional studies, you know, people have damage, and now we can kind of see the activity through certain ways. We know that the left and right hemisphere are specialized a little bit. There's different regions that are doing one thing on one side that aren't really doing the similar thing on the other side. So everybody's heard of left brain, right brain people, right? Like your right side of your brain was doing like artsy stuff, and your left side of the brain was doing like your reason and analysis and stuff like that. And then the big thing was that Broca's area, speech center, and the Wernicke's area, that language interpretation center, was on the left side of the brain and wasn't on the right. Okay, so that's hemispheric local lateralization. That is, the right and left brain aren't exactly doing the same thing, even though they kind of look the same. This is a very interesting kind of concept. And there's, you know, you hear a lot of pop psychology about right brain, left brain that isn't quite right, but there is a lot to it. There's definitely differences between the two. And another funny thing about it is people who lose like the ability, they might have damage in some of these areas on their left brain, like a stroke or something, and they can't remember, they don't know how to speak anymore. They could still sing, right? Because like singing might come from this side. So you could they could sing things, but they can't speak things. So it's really weird. So now you kind of get a sense, right? Instead of this simple reflex, this integration thing is like huge. This just doesn't really kind of give it proper respect about what's going on in there, even from the very cursory, you know, kind of introduction that you just saw right there. Really, it's not just going in here and putting out an output, right? Sensory information is going in and it's bouncing around all these different systems to kind of give the final output, right? And then there's going to be all this feedback, right? But the other thing is, when you see that glass of water, you're not just a blank slate thinking there is a glass of water, must drink, right? Not like a knee-jerk reflex. You are thirsty or you aren't thirsty, and that's going to affect your behavior, right? So you have these certain internal states that is going to be incorporated into this whole thing right here, right? Whether you're hungry, whether you're thirsty, whether you're tired, right? Whatever kind of state you might be in is going to affect how this information is bouncing around in here, right? And we're not going to get into this too much, but I'm bringing up, you know, this whole next region, this limbic system. We talked about this motivation, executive function area, like planning and everything like that, and the prefrontal cortex. But we also have this other part of your brain, this lower part of your brain that's dealing with a lot of your emotions, right? And how you're feeling at this any given moment right here, and things you might be afraid of, and all your particular emotional state. And there's a lot of crosstalk in here. That's when this area has gone awry, that's, you know, when people start thinking people need lobotomies and stuff, right? But there's also all this other stuff that's going on in this lower parts of your brain that are making you be motivated toward one thing or another, right? Neuroscientists usually call, you know, the motivated behaviors, right? The 4 F's: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproductive behavior, right? All these are kind of generating different states. And if you're scared, you'll flee, right? If you're angry, you'll fight. If you're hungry, you know, you'll feed. If you're, anyway, any of those motivational states, right, are going to kind of affect how all this pathways are bouncing around in here. But this whole little region is your limbic system. But it's got a lot of crosstalk between your rational, reasonable brain and your emotional brain, right? So this is your limbic system in here, right? And it's all about kind of emotional. You'll, I mean, in your any kind of test you have, it's where's the emotional brain? It's the limbic system in particular. We're going to look at this amygdala you'll hear of, right? The amygdala is this whole fear and anxiety processing. It like processes incoming information for fear content or anxious content. And if you have an overactive amygdala, right, because you read too many headlines about stuff, right, everything that you see, you're in this constant state of anxiety, right? So this limbic system, particularly the amygdala, is all about this emotional processing information. And so this part of your cortical area, or at least cerebral part, is the cingulate gyrus right around the corpus callosum. Over here, involved in that emotional regulation, talking to your prefrontal cortex. Right, that's where you might get the prefrontal lobotomy stuff, connections cut, right? The hippocampus is part of the limbic system because this is where it was first discovered, but really, if you see memory, that's what you want to think of with the hippocampus. Because again, when you have very high emotional content experience, you tend to remember it better, right? I don't have a reference for you guys, right? In my day, they talked about everybody knew where they were when JFK was shot, right? In my day, it was like, where were you during 9/11 or something? And you probably have your own personal stuff where you can draw up emotional memories, right? Because they're stored really tightly in your memory based on emotional experience. And you can remember like exactly where you were and what we were wearing and like little stupid details, right? In any case, hippocampus, memory formation, storage, and retrieval. Amygdala is that little nuclei that's basically kind of fear and aggression. So, people who have problems with this, if they have an overactive amygdala, they're very afraid, they're very aggressive, right? If they have a loss of function, if you destroy their amygdala, they're really relaxed and they're like oversexed and everything, right? If it's a rat, they cut it off and they start humping everything around them, right? So there's a weird kind of connection with your amygdala on that. And then the final output of all this limbic system is your hypothalamus, right? So come up with the hypothalamus again, because that is going to actually mediate all those things like beating hearts, sweating, shaking, all that racing pulse stuff, right? That's your visceral response to emotions, right? And if you think about it, like you get angry, right? You're flushed, right? You're kind of trembling, your heart's beating, you're like, you could feel it. That's the visceral response. And that's all mediated by the hypothalamus right there. Blood flow, right? Heart beating, sweating, all that stuff. So for your limbic system, right? You're getting this sensory stimuli, but it's being, interpreted first through all your sensory stuff. Some of it goes directly into your limbic system, but there's going to be a lot of crosstalk here to kind of analyze whatever you're conscious of for emotional content through your limbic system, right? And the output of your limbic system is going to be the hypothalamus, right? And that's where you're going to get that autonomic responses, maybe endocrine secretion like adrenaline and stuff like that. And what this chart is showing is that especially long-term stress and emotional response affects your immune system in usually negative ways, right? It overacts your immune system, it represses it in certain times, right? So that, you're more liable to get sick when you're in these high emotional states, especially anxiety and stuff like that. All right, but that's your limbic system. And your hypothalamus, and that's your limbic system. And then the other thing, this again, a lot of these are not in your slides because I'm not really going to ask you about this, but I want to kind of point out that for when I said the hippocampus was about memory formation, you have memory, when you process all this higher order information, you're building a picture of the world. Like think about where you parked your car this morning or something, right? Somewhere in there during that point, you formed a memory of that, right? Because your hippocampus was kind of talking to those, all the neurons that were involved in all the vision, sensory experience of parking your car or whatever. And so you did something over here and you kind of stored it in a funny way in your hippocampus. And then when you wanted to remember something, right, your hippocampus would kind of activate that same neural circuitry that it was originally made you conscious of that event, right? And that's what your hippocampus is doing. Short-term memory stuff is happening in your frontal lobes over there, but your kind of long-term formation is happening in the hippocampus. But again, hippocampus memory, that's basically all you got to know. All right. So that really covers it for your functions of your cerebrum, right? In a whirlwind of activity right there. And so maybe I'll talk like a couple more minutes and then we'll break and then we'll go back just to finish off the cerebellum and basal nuclei, and then we'll go into your brain protection stuff like your cerebral spinal fluid. I'll just mention here, when we talked about all the activity going on in your brain and how we monitor it these days, as people studying it, one way is to take all these electrodes, put them all over your brain and look at the big activity, like the major patterns of activity that are going on in your brain, right? And they've worked it out such that they know that this wave over here, if they get this certain frequencies per second over here, this is 1 second. If this goes 8 to 13, right, this is with the typical association with somebody who's awake, right? Not just kind of relaxed a little bit and awake, right? And these, if you were sleeping, you would look something more like this down here, right? So somebody who's trained this can kind of tell what your brain, based on your brain activity,
it's 19
what
hours.
your kind of level of arousal is, right? If you were really active, working hard at something like that, right, you'd be like this. Or if you were really totally stressed out like this, you'd have waves like this, right? So all that has to do with your general brain activity going on, not in any particular part of the brain, but just overall. And those are the EEGs you might have heard of, right? And they use this also to declare somebody brain dead, right? If they're brain dead, if their activity, right, looks something like whatever it looks like in that point, then they declare them brain dead, right? And then the other ways that you've probably heard of trying to understand brain function is, when we talked about those Broca's areas and everything like that, and Wernicke's areas. Over here, we talked about, seeing stuff, like hearing stuff, and then like speaking stuff, right? We're all happening in very particular parts of the brain. And this, what somebody does here is take some kind of radioactive glucose, they drink it, and your brain is, takes up, is greedy, very greedy for glucose. And when it's active, it's using a lot, it uses more energy, it takes up more glucose. So they can kind of monitor that through these PET scans right here by monitoring the radioactive glucose when you're doing certain tasks. That's one reason we know what's going on in particular regions of the brain when you're doing certain activities, right? This is a PET scan. And then the other one would be a functional MRI, right? Magnetic resonance imaging, which is kind of manipulating the hydrogen ions all around your brain with this magnetic stuff. And then they could have you do tasks or have you do in certain states, right? Like this is the kind of baseline activity in a normal person. This is somebody who's taken the hallucinogenic LSD and looked at the differences in brain activity, right, of what's going on with them, right? When they are when their serotonin antagonists have been kind of manipulated or whatever, right? And they can kind of see what happens at certain brain states like that, because this one is monitoring oxygen content. The brain cells are much more active. They're taking in more oxygen rather than glucose. It's much less invasive. You don't have to drink radioactive sugar for this fMRI to work. Anyway, that's just another way to image brain stuff.